Ask any interstellar rulers whether the running of their domain is easy, and most likely you'll find that it's a rather difficult task indeed to keep up with all the minutiae. For the Imperium of Man, however, the problems of management are so vast and convoluted as to make the job basically impossible. The Administratum, the Departmentum Unitorum, and many other major imperial groups are often complained about for the slowness of their response to a situation. But in all truth, almost all imperial power is devolved from central control just to try and get things moving at all. In fact, the rulers of a planet can pretty much run their worlds however they wish, so long as they do exactly one thing for the Imperium. When the higher-ups come calling, they demand the Imperium's due, and the planet must provide or face the consequences. Sometimes referred to as Terra's due or the Grand Harvesting, it is known officially as the Imperial Tithe. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. The Imperial Tithe was first instituted long ago, back in the Great Crusade in fact, by the civilian Council of Terra led by Malcador the Sigillite. This body was responsible for creating the law of the Imperium, which had to that point been the Emperor's own military dictatorship, and the Tithe was part of these reforms that would presumably help to keep the Imperium running from day to day. However, as you might expect, given it was essentially a giant tax bill being slapped on every single world, the Tithe was a controversial thing across the galaxy, which, bear in mind, had only been brought to compliance by the Legiones Astartes less than a generation ago. Perhaps it had only just been brought to compliance, and now it was being whacked with taxes. I don't know whether there were many rebellions against the Tithe. I'm pretty sure there were, but people just gloss over it because of what happened later. But it wouldn't surprise me if many of the worlds that signed on with the traitors in the Horus Heresy at least had it in the back of their minds in terms of the planetary governors and things like that. That said, the Tithe did survive the heresy just as the Imperium did, but records don't seem to indicate whether it evolved much under the reforms of Robert Guilliman in its aftermath. I'd wager it didn't change much, if at all, since a lot of the reforms back then were much more focused on military, with things like the Codex Astartes, but I'm unsure, and I suspect that the Codex Imperialis, Guilliman's new book, might actually be addressing the Tithe among many other things. So, how does the thing actually work, since it's been here and the Imperium's been chafing under its impositions ever since? Well, there's two major aspects to the Imperial Tithe, with two entirely separate organisations collecting their own set of taxes, though their collective takings are grouped together under the title of Terra's due. The first, perhaps more measurable aspect of the Tithe is the one taken by the organisation known as the Departmentum Unitorum. This administratum department was founded back in the Great Crusade, built from the naval administrative body known as the Corps Logisticae, and it is responsible for all things logistical within the imperial military. The nature of the tithes will probably vary a little from world to world, but one thing remains pretty much constant whenever the Munitorum decides to come calling, and that is manpower. As the department is responsible for the raising of new regiments for the Astra Militarum, the tithes they collect are used to build said regiments. Typically, 10% of a world's planetary defense force, the most elite soldiers a planet will usually have available under 99% of circumstances, will be used in the formation of any regiments the Munitorum requires, though of course, if they need it, they can of course ask for more. Given the size of many worlds and thus their defensive forces, just by taking sheer percentages, this tithe will allow large numbers of regiments to be founded every single time that a founding takes place. But that's not typically all that gets taken. After all, a regiment typically needs more than just bodies even before you get to advanced things like transports and tanks, and so where available, all the necessary material will be taken to supply the new regiment as well. Armour and lasguns will probably be a typical yield, as most every world likely has some industry for the basics like that. Well, maybe. but more industrialized worlds may be able to provide much more than that with powerful, unique heirloom weapons, communication systems, maybe even tanks, though I suspect that Forge worlds handle the majority of the big stuff. However, the Munitorum's tithes are a little more complex and frustrating than just, after a certain period of time, have X resources and Y competent soldiers on hand. You see, whilst the tithing cycle is of course different for every world, you may expect that given every world has different populations and different natural resources it can create, it's not exactly consistent even for a single world or planetary governor. The needs of the Imperium are ever shifting, with more regiments often being needed all the time and in a great hurry due to the attritional nature of its military and wars, because there's a lot of wars and a lot of attrition means a lot of people are getting killed, means you need more replacements. This means that rather than just stop by every decade or once a generation or whatever, the Munitorum can pretty much come calling whenever it so pleases, with representatives being based on every world to ensure that the demands are always met. We'll get into what happens afterward if you dare say no. In fact, I actually heard tell that one world was visited a staggering total of 9 times within a single Terran year by the Munitorum, which is totally insane. It takes between 70 and 90% of the PDF from the start of that year, depending on how you calculate your percentages, which probably left the world in question vulnerable to being invaded itself. And you actually then wonder why so many people complain about the tithes. In the case of the Munitorums, we haven't even got to the rest of it, it can rip families apart on almost a moment's notice, leave planets weaker than they need to be in an already hostile galaxy, and just be very, very inconvenient, but there's even worse to come. The second part of the Imperial Tithe is known simply as the Exacta. Whereas the Munitorum's tithe is concerned with all things military, the Exacta is concerned with basically everything else. Money, more resources such as minerals, food, whatever is so suited to the world in question based on its production, type, location, needs of nearby worlds, needs of the Imperium every 5 minutes, whatever. That means that every world, as well as having a reasonably large and well-trained standing army at all times to ensure the Munitorum's demands are properly met, must also stockpile potentially a huge amount of stuff, just in case the Administratum stops by and demands that they take it. This in turn means that said huge amount of stuff cannot be used on the development of the planet, the feeding of its people, and things like that. Which probably doesn't concern most planetary governors because most planetary governors are not nice people, but it is still worth noting nonetheless. And again, as with the Munitorum's tithe, the Exacta could be called in at basically any time, especially since the random nature of warp travel means that even a regular scheduled visit could arrive very early or very late, meaning that there's no real consistency. So if you're an agri-world without high-quality food preservation facilities for some reason, you really are stuck if they arrive at a bad time, and I'm sure there's many more that I'm not thinking of right now. The group responsible for collecting the Exacta tithe is known, perhaps unoriginally, as the Departamento Exacta, another subgroup of the Administratum just like the Munitorum. I assume, just like the Munitorum, that there are Exacta adepts on every Imperial world that pays the tithe. We'll get to the exceptions that don't in a moment, and they ensure that it's all paid on time and in full. And honestly, there's a lot riding on those payments being precisely that, in full and on time, because the Departamento Exacta is rather exacting when it comes to that. No matter what the situation or circumstance on a planet, or whatever it so happens to be doing, maybe even if it's embroiled in a war that's drained everything it's got, the Departamento Exacta demands it receives its tithes exactly when it asks for them, in exactly the amounts it asks for. And that's a problem, since if it doesn't get what it wants when it wants it, the consequences are dire. Exceptionally dire. The failure to pay up will, at the almost absolute minimum, see the Adeptus Terra hand down the ultimate sanction on the failed planetary governor. The Adeptus Arbites will be called upon to execute the governor, presumably setting up a much more reliable and compliant replacement who will pay up no matter how much the planet may need the resources. However, not every governor or ruling class is dealt with so easily, and on more than one occasion I'm sure a world has been driven to rebellion or instability by their inability or refusal to pay the exactor. This is also true for the Munitorum's tithe, which will probably see possibly more fierce resistance due to the whole conscription family separation thing. When this sort of thing happens, the administratum aren't exactly going to let the place go because it just didn't feel like paying taxes, sends the wrong message. So they do the only reasonable thing and send in the military. Cities, worlds, even entire subsectors have burned under the Astra Militarum's heel because worlds refused to meet their tithes. In all truth, many of those wars were so expensive in terms of manpower, lives lost, and resources used that they probably cost more than the world or worlds in question would have ever provided in tithes for goodness knows how long. And all that assumes that no one takes advantage of this rebellion to strike at the worlds during or after them, which then takes up even more unnecessary time and resources than before, because had they not spent the first lot, there wouldn't be this second group of invaders, meaning that more had to be spent. And all that assumes in turn that the rebellion wasn't being orchestrated from the shadows by, for example, Chaos Worshippers, who will probably unleash a demonic incursion as well that may leave the world dead or untouchable for a long time afterward. I can think of at least one example of that happening. There's a Slaneshi world involving Paragonians and Black Templars, though its name escapes me at this moment. However, as I hinted at, it may interest you to know that there are worlds which are in fact entirely exempt from the exactor or the Munitorum tithes. There are several grades of tithe within the overall system, the highest being known as Experima, and then working through grades of Exactis, Decuma, and Salutio, but the lowest grade is known as Aptus Non. This grading means that the world in question does not have to pay tithes to the administratum in the same way as other worlds, but that's not to say they have it easy in life or just get off scot-free. Worlds such as the lifeless dead worlds that can provide basically nothing, not even men, receive Aptus Non, whilst most of the worlds that have a populace as well as this grading will provide their own unique form of service to the Imperium as a whole that cannot be found most anywhere else. Examples would be the Forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus or the various home worlds of the Adeptus Astartes, just to give you an idea of worlds that receive Aptus Non. The former needs every resource it can get just to produce stuff, and is also technically outside the Administratum's purview due to the Treaty of Olympus, whilst the latter, I don't know actually. They recruit too young to affect the PDF, so maybe it's just about resource conservation and not inconveniencing space marine politics? Not sure. Of course, everything I've said up to now is just a general case, and there will be isolated worlds that do behave differently due to their own unique circumstances. It's a big galaxy after all. The only worlds I've heard of for Aptus Non in a random planet is when you find ones with a large psyker population that can be supplied to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and their black ships. It's still a tithe, but just a different one due to their own situation, if you want an example of those unique circumstances. To finish off, let's touch on the only tithe that's applied universally that I think I've missed, applied to one of the groups whose worlds are Aptus Non. The Adeptus Astartes must provide their own form of taxation to either the Administratum or the Adeptus Mechanicus. Sources seem to conflict on who officially gets the payment, though I think the Mechanicus is the typical recipient. Rather than sparing soldiers or resources from their forges, the Space Marines instead give up perhaps the most precious thing they possess outside of possibly chapter relics, their gene seed, 5% of it exactly, whenever payment is due. There are several reasons for this tithe being taken, though the main two are typically purity monitoring as well as stockpiling for future chapter foundings. And again, there are dire consequences if you don't pay up, even if the chapters seem to get a little more slack than other authorities because, you know, they're kind of very limited in number and many of them will be off fighting wars at once. They may not have anyone who can give it up. If you don't believe me, consider that the Badab War was basically just a tithing dispute that then escalated into a sector-spanning bloodbath once the tithe ships got shot down by the Astral Claws under Luftfuhren. Yeah. That's what happens when you don't pay up. And there you have it, a look into the Imperial Tithe and much of the details concerning its components. Sure, this log was a little bit shorter and a bit drier than some others, since I know that politics, administration, and that sort of thing don't always interest everyone, but hopefully it should give you an idea as to how the Grand Harvesting works, and thus how the Imperium is run and basically keeps itself afloat. As for the tithes themselves, in summary, they may be something of a necessary evil corroded into a mess by the size of the Imperium and the randomness of warp travel. I remember stumbling across an old Terran saying about the only certainties in life being death and taxes. And when you apply that to the Imperium, it's certainly true. I certainly wouldn't want to be under the Imperial rule for many reasons, but the tithe certainly is another factor. For now though, we must move on. Next time, I want to do something similar to the log I made recently about the Legiones Daemonica, completing a bestiary of sorts. However, the log I'm planning to make will absolutely not complete the roster, as I wish to focus on one part of the species in particular before completing the list in one or more later logs. For now, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.